Thank you, Hans. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me at the Electrification Academy. And thank you for the opportunity to present our paper today. I know that it's a really busy time with lots of events happening in the energy and electrification world, so especially grateful. Sorry, it's technical difficulties. My name is Sophie Yule-Bennett. I'm a senior policy advisor at the Regulatory Assistance Project, otherwise known as RAP. RAP is a global team of policy advisors working on the clean energy transition, and I work in our European power markets team. So there's been quite a lot to keep us busy recently. So today I'll be presenting our paper, The Joy of Flex, and focusing particularly on 5 key actions for activating household demand-side flexibility. My co-author, Louise Sunderland, unfortunately can't be here today because she's speaking at an event in the EU Parliament presenting an energy poverty handbook. So we'll forgive her for that because it's very important as well. So just to provide a little bit of context, the main objective of the Joy of Flex paper was to try and put down in one place all of the various different policy strands that need to come together concurrently to unleash household flexibility as a power system resource. There were lots of really excellent papers on demand-side flexibility. A lot of them are quite technical and they focus on specific areas like explicit demand response services, for example. Historically, the emphasis and the attention is on industrial demand response. So we wanted to look at how it might work in the household context for reasons which I'll come on to, and move the conversation all forward from why do we need it to how can we do it. And finally, just wanted to put it into an accessible language format, because so often our job is translating these highly technical papers for policy advisors who care about the clean energy transition, or for consumer advocates that care about the customer experience. But there wasn't anything that had everything in one place that was accessible. So that's the purpose of this report, is to try and create that to enable this conversation to take place. So before we get into it, just to take a step back and get right down to the basics. What is demand side flexibility? So even before we go into that, the demand side means the users of energy. The supply side is those who produce and deliver energy. And when we talk about the demand side, or customers on things happening on the demand side, we talk about activities that take place on the customer side of the meter, including, in some cases, generation, like rooftop solar, or storage, like EV batteries or home batteries, and even energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is a really important part of demand-side flexibility because it's natural thermal storage of buildings. So we'll come on to energy efficiency again, but just to put it at the forefront that energy efficiency and demand-side flexibility go hand in hand. So demand-side flexibility is the ability of customers to choose when they draw energy from the grid, responding to a market signal or some other financial incentive. So they're changing their usual consumption patterns to create an additional capacity on the system, which is sometimes known as a negawatt, like a negative megawatt. So customers might shift non-time critical loads like industrial processes or heating and cooling to cheaper periods, or use on-site generation like rooftop solar or storage, including batteries in EV batteries, or thermal storage in the form of energy efficiency. There are 2 types of demand-side flexibility. There's explicit, which is a defined service like frequency response or balancing reserves or capacity markets. Those are usually procured by an energy system operator or government. And there's implicit demand-side flexibility, which is where customers save money on their energy bills by responding to price signals, which might be a time of use tariff or a dynamic tariff, which tracks wholesale prices. It can get a bit complicated because independent third parties called aggregators can bid customer flexibility in an aggregated basis into explicit demand side services, but the customer might see the benefit using some kind of price-based mechanism like a cashback on their bill or something like that. So there is all of these terms are designed with industrial processes in mind, and we're still in the middle of an evolution in terms of how it might work in the household context. And just included this image from the paper as well, because there is a sort of acronym soup thing that happens with demand side flexibility. When we came to define demand side flexibility, we found that there is no one definitive answer. There's no definition of demand side flexibility, certainly in European law. We talk about demand response as being the changing of the load patterns for financial benefit, but demand response or demand side response, as it's sometimes known, doesn't usually include export onto the grid. It includes using on-site generation so that you are then changing your consumption from the grid, but it doesn't include vehicle to grid export or exporting solar from your rooftop or battery. So demand side flexibility is that wider category, which includes those technologies and applications as well. And sometimes people use demand side flexibility to talk about the customer capacity or ability to flex, not just the actual action of doing it as well. And demand side flexibility and demand response are part of a wider umbrella term of distributed energy resources, or DERs, and those include all decentralized resources that can provide grid services, but some of those might be not on the demand side. So demand side flexibility happens on the customer side of the meter, but local wind farms or solar farms, community energy might be supply side. So those are DERs, but they're not demand side flexibility. So why do we need it? Well, demand side flexibility is really important. We need lots of it, and we need it really quickly in order to meet our zero carbon emissions goals. The International Energy Agency predicts that by 2030, which is not that far away now, we need to increase the amount of demand side flexibility we have globally by tenfold. In our modern energy system, the ability to match demand with low cost wind and solar supply is really important. We are not going to get to 100% renewable energy on the supply side and integrate these newly electrified loads, particularly transport and heat, in a cost efficient and fast way without demand side flexibility. We can do it in a much more costly way. It involves building out the grid and having to have backup fossil fuel generation and other sorts of more expensive supply side low carbon generation like nuclear. But in order to do it fast and in a cost efficient way, we need demand side flexibility. This was never a problem before in the old days, where we knew what our demand patterns were going to be, and we could ramp up fossil fuel generation to meet that demand. Now it's the other way around. On the supply side, we have this amazing new system where we have zero marginal cost, clean, intermittent, renewable generation, and the supply side has evolved, but the demand side hasn't evolved to align with that. So we need to create this flexible, dynamic demand side so that we can make the most of renewable energy when it's generating, and we can make the most of our grid capacity. Just like in the same way as to make the most of our train assets, we might have off-peak and on-peak pricing so that we encourage people to use trains off-peak, and so the peak trains aren't so busy. And this is just a demonstration of just, what a difference a day makes in terms of the carbon intensity of the system from one day to the next. So in terms of cost and carbon, demand side flexibility gives us tools to shift our consumption to match cheaper, greener periods. And there's separately to a mainstream demand side flexibility, there's also this movement called carbon flexing, which is where customers can optimize for carbon, which is not exactly the same as optimizing for cost. And there's a link to another paper on that in the Joy of Flex paper. So if we can do this well, there's just a huge benefits for us and for society and for the planet. We're used to thinking about the energy transition in terms of something called the energy trilemma, which are 3 objectives of sustainability, reliability, and equity, including affordability. And we've been taught, or I was certainly taught, back in 2006 when I started working in energy policy, these things put against each other, and it's a trade-off. It's a balancing exercise. You can't have it all. If you prioritize one thing, then you have to sacrifice another thing. So demand-side flexibility, when I first sort of understood what demand-side flexibility meant, this bit blew my mind, because I thought, well, we just killed the energy trilemma, because actually we can have all of these things. In demand-side flexibility, it brings all of these things together rather than pulling them apart. We've talked a little bit about sustainability already. It's crucial for faster, more efficient decarbonisation. We need flexibility. But the reliability aspects of demand-side flexibility are not talked about so much. So flexible buildings are like a form of resilience and adaptation for the grid. If we lived in an area where there were lots of earthquakes, we would automatically expect our governments to build our buildings in a way that they're earthquake proof. But we're not building our buildings and our transport systems in a naturally flexible way to make the most of intermittent renewable energy and to meet the climate and the energy challenges ahead. So on an everyday basis, we need flexibility to optimize that renewable energy and to manage the grid, where we have new electrified loads like EVs and heat pumps, electric vehicles and heat pumps. But demand-side flexibility makes us safer during extreme weather events and other energy crises. And they help us to prevent prolonged outages, because it gives the system operator the ability to have, if things go really bad, rolling outages that keep people safe. Plus, as we've mentioned, energy efficiency and on-site flexibility, like batteries and on-site generation, give people natural resilience in the event of an outages. They can use themselves as a cushion, or they can share those resources within the community to keep people safe. So that's an equity issue, because the people who are most vulnerable often live in the worst performing houses. But affordability is a bigger issue, because by reducing those avoidable network upgrades and the backup generation, flexibility reduces the system costs for everybody. And customers who can be more flexible get a direct benefit as well, because they get their bill savings or direct revenue from their flexibility. And this is another image from the paper, which just demonstrates that we need demand-side flexibility across all timeframes. But it's tempting to focus just on peak shaving or peak demand reduction, particularly at the moment, because we're in the middle of this gas crisis. But actually, we need to balance the system at all times. Even when demand's low, we still need supply and demand to match. So if demand's low, but we have lots of wind or solar on the system, we need to increase demand. And that means that it's decreased at another point in time where there might not be so many renewables and we might be dependent on gas. And even in the long term, having better visibility into how customers will react to price signals gives system operators the data to predict how much generation we actually need, so that we're not paying for new power stations that we don't need, or paying for subsidies like capacity mechanisms, which might be usually fossil fuel subsidies, in order to keep the lights on. So it helps us from years in advance to second by second frequency response adjustment. It's not just about peak shifting. So why households? Well, we chose households because households represent the last mile of customer flexibility. But actually, many of the recommendations in the paper also help other types of customer. Large energy users like steel producers have been reducing costs through flexibility for decades, since the 1970s or so, but it's only just become feasible on a household scale thanks to smart meters and other digital innovations. The European Commission predicted that by 2030, households will provide the greatest untapped potential for demand-side capacity in Europe. As we move to electric heating and transport systems, that means that households aren't just passive energy users, they're key agents of change. And this is just a chart showing that data point that I just mentioned. So the green bit is the household capacity. And it's also just worth mentioning, this is 2016 is a long time ago in terms of the innovation of demand side flexibility and digital energy services. And as we'll come on to, we're not very good at predicting innovation generally and demand side potential. So it's likely that the figures themselves will be a huge underestimate, but I thought the proportions here were surprising to me, and so and they're quite staggering. So that's why I've included those. So what does it look like? Well, this is a smart multi-occupancy building with some shared flexible assets. It's not just all about having large detached homes with affluent people in. It can be made to work for buildings with shared assets. Flexibility can be manual, like turning things up, down, on or off, but the real magic happens when you introduce digital, often automated technologies, which can be pre-programmed or may even track and optimize wholesale prices. So this is what flexibility looks like. And this is what it shouldn't look like. So it's not about ironing your clothes at night, despite what certain British tabloid newspapers like to say. There's a flexible and inflexible load in every home. So if I need a cup of tea, I might boil the kettle, and because I want my tea now, that's not flexible load. But other energy uses are not time critical. For example, I don't care when my dishes are washed, as long as they're clean when I want them. Same with my clothes, same with if I charge up my EV, I need it when I need it, but I don't care when the battery draws power from the grid. Ironing may be a bad example post-COVID, because potentially that's a type of demand that we can just ditch for good. It's also not about treating customers like cogs in a machine or some kind of matrix style resource where we can just sort of suck the value out of customers and not reward them. That's not what we mean when we're talking about demand side flexibility as a vital system resource. Agency, informed consent and fair rewards will be even more essential in the age of automation, not less. And finally, every home has some kind of inherent flexibility, but how much it is affected by pre-existing inequalities like quality of housing stock, disposable income and home ownership. So we need to avoid creating a two-tier system where we pitch flexible customers against inflexible customers in a way that perpetuates energy poverty. We need to maximise those global benefits while helping households to access the direct benefits as well. So the barriers are sort of mirrored in solutions. So I'm just going to touch upon them really quickly just to give an overview of what they are. First barrier is sort of a psychological framing barrier. We are treating flexibility as an individual customer responsibility. I mean, we've still come on leaps and bounds from the traditional viewing customers as being completely passive to now being in a situation where we have prosumers, and the legislation says, you know, customers who want to be flexible, who want to be active, should have the right to do so if they really want to. But that's not the same as saying, okay, we really need all customers to be flexible, and here's how we rigorously incentivize them to do that so that we can decarbonize our system in a more efficient way. Secondly, we're really bad at measuring the value and potential of flexibility and innovation generally. Pricing, wholesale market doesn't reflect the full system value of flexibility. Explicit demand-side flexibility platforms are still discriminatory and inefficient, where customers even have the technical access to those markets, which is not everywhere. Flexible assets, by which we mean the technologies that we need to supersize the ability of customers to be flexible, like EVs and heat pumps, for example, and energy efficiency. They're not accessible to many customers. And finally, on the retail side, the offers and services are still inaccessible, or they're seen as risky. Even if they're not risky, they're still seen as risky. But for demand side flexibility and households to scale, customers must be both willing and able to flex. And the current policy strategies they don't pull these together, they don't adequately support these things. So we created an action plan. The first principle for that action plan is that we need to approach demand side flexibility as a vital system resource and back it like any other vital energy infrastructure. So that's what this action plan is aiming to achieve. And I'll go through each of the actions in more detail in a minute, but just to flag at the outset that this isn't a sequence. All of these actions need to happen concurrently. And they're interrelated, particularly the last two about, having assets in homes and making things easy and accessible. So they all need to happen at the same time so that we can create a positive feedback loop where customers are incentivized to flex, they're seeing the benefits of flexibility, and then they're incentivized to invest in more technologies and services that will help them to be more flexible in the future. It's not do this thing, then this thing, then this thing. So firstly, here's the metrics, and stay with me because I know it's difficult to make metrics exciting, but metrics are really important because if we don't understand the full value and the full contributions of demand side flexibility, we can't advocate for policies that draw those values out. And also we might invest in more expensive and inefficient alternatives, which might be green hydrogen for heating, or continuing to build up the gas grid, or investing in subsidising new fossil fuel generating stations through capacity markets. So when we're planning for resource adequacy, so security of supply, currently those assessments tend to be based on what is technically in the system now or what is predicted based on that uptake. It doesn't include the impact of policies and technology developments that might unlock those markets and deliver more value, the cost savings. And it doesn't take into account the full values, including things like system interoperability and even social advantages, like health advantages of demand side flexibility. We need to internalize all those externalities. Also, if we don't have a common systematic way of measuring demand side flexibility, then it makes it difficult to set flexibility targets or to impose obligations on suppliers to achieve flexible outcomes, and makes it difficult to track progress and to benchmark between different countries. So we recommend developing what is a European focused, but some kind of common methodology for assessing the broad ranging demand side flexible contributions. So identify what those values are, interpret potential not as just what is there now, but what could be available if you actually align policy incentives properly. And we also need data transparency, because in order to work out how things might have been done differently, for example, how grid services could be better, more efficiently provided through demand side resources, we need to actually understand the underlying assumptions of system operators, which we don't currently have access to that. And finally, we need to supplement all these modelling exercises with real trials, because when you have trials, particularly ones that go beyond pilots at scale, there were always added values and learning that we hadn't factored in. Secondly, so this is the market piece. We need to incentivize flexibility through energy market price signals. The energy market design has been subject to lots of scrutiny recently for obvious reasons. And energy bills are like layer cakes. So all of these costs, the wholesale market price, the network costs, the profit margins of the energy companies, the imbalanced services, which is where the system operator has to come in and balance supply and demand at the last minute. All of these things create costs in the energy bill. But each of these costs is also an opportunity for cost reduction through demand side flexibility. So here's an example, and it's a bit of a complicated diagram, but it's just to show that so suppliers act as a gateway between customers and the rest of the market. But even the innovative suppliers like the Octopuses of the world and the OVOs, they can only pass on value that they themselves can capture in the supply chain. If the supplier, if it doesn't matter, the supplier is still being charged the same, where the customers are using the electricity at times that are more efficient or less efficient for the network, then the supplier, then there's no point in for the supplier incentivizing customers to act in an efficient way, because the supplier won't get the benefit. You can't pass that value on to customers. So it's about stacking up these signals and about trying to align the customer incentives with the market incentives and the things that drive efficiency. And that is about global supply and demand on the network, but also local congestion. So we need smart network tariffs that have different signals based on time of use, location, and direction of flow. We need to make sure we're paying network companies not just based on cost recovery for capital expenditure, but in a way that genuinely incentivizes them to use demand side flexibility. We need to motivate suppliers to balance their own traded positions, so to match their own demand side with the supply, the generation that they've bought as much as they can by using demand side flexibility before the system operator has to come in after the traded window through the balancing market and sort everything out in a way that's more expensive for customers. And of course, there have to be safeguards. So there are extreme situations, there are polar vortexes, there are wars, there are capacity crunches where we need safeguards to protect vulnerable customers, particularly because what we want is price elasticity. But at a certain point, prices might be so high that everyone that can flex, that has the ability to do so, has done so, and prices continuing to rise is therefore just penalizing people and might result in demand destruction, which is when, you know, factories close down and move to another country, for example, or customers in the households might be under consuming in a way that's not safe for them. So we need safeguards built in, but it's like being vegan. You know, we don't need everyone to be a strict vegan, but if more people ate more plant-based, then the environment would be better off. So it's about having a balance and making sure those price signals are moving in the right direction overall. Thirdly, we need to make sure that there's a level playing field for demand side resources. This is about the explicit grid services where we're bidding in for defined services. The Clean Energy for All Europeans package gave customers the ability, in theory, to access all markets on a non-discriminatory basis, and also the right of all customers to request a dynamic energy tariff, but it's poorly implemented. I think only France and Estonia have fully implemented all of these provisions. There's direct discrimination in eligibility criteria and product design for these grid services. So direct discrimination would be not letting the demand side in at all, or saying, okay, well, you can only have a 1-year contract, whereas generators can get a 15-year contract. Explicit bias, where the same rules apply to everybody, but they impact the demand side in a in a worse way, like, for example, having really big minimum bid sizes that require aggregators to get lots and lots of customer contracts, but then if one person doesn't deliver, then no one gets paid. So it pushes all the risk onto these new market entrants in a way that's unjustified and not proportionate. ASA are in the middle of developing a new network code which looks at some of these access barriers. It doesn't apply to capacity mechanisms, but it goes some of the way. But what we need is technology inclusivity. So it's not one size fits all. You can't treat a customer in the same way as you treat a generating station. As things that look neutral are actually just based around the needs of incumbents. And this is a part that's really close to my heart, because when I was general counsel of a demand side flexibility startup, we tried really hard to engage in lots of stakeholder workshops with the energy regulator in the UK and with government, and all of these working groups are really time intensive, and startups just can't afford to have people full-time secondees in government departments, and it's really difficult to get your views across if you're having to respond to 100-page consultations that are just being churned out all of the time. So we really need to find more sophisticated ways of getting that input from innovators and new market entrants. And then practically, we need to be able to streamline all these flexibility markets so that you can bid in across multiple timeframes at the same time, and everything is sort of standardized rather than having lots of different products with exclusivity clauses which are not justified between them. So if you can stack those up, it's called value stacking, and it's cheaper and more efficient. And finally, we need data transparency, as we said, so that we can actually allow third parties to come in, offer alternatives to supply side grid services. There's already something called the energy efficiency first principle in the governance regulation, which says that if a demand side solution is more cost efficient, it should be used, but it's not being applied in practice. Fourth, this is the practical bit. And I'm sure that the audience of the Electrification Academy, probably the experts here on these aspects. But just a reminder that customers need to be both able and willing to flex in order to scale household demand side flexibility. And broadly speaking, the ability, the able bit comes from, do you have technologies that mean that you can easily flex without having to run around turning things on and off manually, or sacrificing your comfort on convenience? And the fifth action is about the mental side, the being willing, is assuming that the price signals are in place for the market. Does it work for customers? Is it accessible? Is it simple? Is it enjoyable? So this is the practical stuff. So flexible assets are assets that supersize potential flexibility, like energy efficiency, heat pumps, EVs. We need joined up strategies across energy markets, buildings, transports, and all of these different sectors, because demand side flexibility should really be the bridge between those sectors and the energy markets. But sometimes it feels like it falls down the gap in between. So, you go to a energy markets webinar or read a paper, and it's focused on supply side solutions, and then you look at sort of buildings or transport policy stuff, and it doesn't factor in all these added value for the grid that could be an extra selling point for these services and technology. So we need to join those up, and the Fit 55 package does go some of the way in doing that, but it could go further. So these are recommendations that we focus specifically on prioritizing flexibility for newly electrified loads. Those are absolutely essential that when we electrify heat and transport, there's a mandate for smartness and interoperability. We need to learn from the mistakes of smart meter rollouts, where customers are paying for assets but they're not seeing the immediate benefits of them, or we're installing technologies that weren't actually fit for purpose in terms of the dynamic application of that digital technology. Technical standards should be outcomes based in terms of what they need to do to avoid lock-in and stranding of having things that aren't fit for purpose. And instead of saying energy efficiency first, that's a starting point, but really we need energy efficiency plus. We have this amazing minimum energy performance standards coming in through the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive in Europe, but we need to integrate flexibility at the same time, particularly heat storage, into those home upgrades while that work's taking place. And in the context of the energy crisis, having targeted support for these technologies pays long-term dividends. So you can give households a handout now, it might help them for this winter. At the moment, current prices might only help them this month, but actually if you install energy efficiency and flexibility, that helps that household next month, the month after, next winter, even next summer, because heat pumps can be used for cooling as well, and energy efficiency is important for pre-cooling buildings too. So it's just a no-brainer. It's a win-win situation. Finally, making actions easy and accessible for customers. So this is sort of the mental element. Just catching up, I've lost myself in my notes. So last but absolutely not least, we have to introduce flexible offers that actually work for customers. So generally speaking, people don't care about kilowatt hours. They just want hot showers and cold beer. It might seem at the moment that everyone's suddenly having to become an energy expert, but generally people don't want to know how the sausage is made. I love my smartphone, but I don't really understand how it works. As long as it works and I can afford it, that's fine by me. You can tell that I'm a lawyer and not a technical person. So this means real choice and tools to demystify and de-risk the process in the customer's eyes. The way that we purchase and use energy is changing. So we need to not put all our eggs in the dynamic tariffs basket. Dynamic energy tariffs have been really important, and they're great for highly flexible loads like EVs and heat pumps. But in the future, people should be able to do a mix and match with sub-metering. So you might have a dynamic tariff for your EV, but then still be able to enjoy a fixed rate for all of your other energy uses, but with flexibility baked into that. So you might get cash back or some other flexibility bonuses. We've sort of fallen into the trap of conflating flexibility with a lack of predictability, while ignoring the fact that customers actually like predictability, or some customers do. But there is scope to have flexibility, like having a fixed rate that is a lower fixed rate than your competitors, because you're factoring in the benefits of that flexibility and those cost savings based on what the supplier estimates they can pass on through the supply chain, but based on an understanding of you being able to flex, heating within certain temperature boundaries, and then you might get cash back or some other uplift or bonus for being even more flexible. So we need to not deprive customers of predictability where they want it. And here, this is just a demonstration of energy as a service plan, where you can have your EV, an annual mileage, or a one charge a day or something like that, and your electricity is unlimited and your heat is agreed within different boundaries. So it's about mixing and matching and having a modular system that works for customers. And regulation, the role of regulation should not be to pick winners and say everyone should have a dynamic tariff or everyone should be part of an energy community. The role of regulation should be to protect customers from when things go wrong, making sure that there's transparency so people clearly understand what they're entering into, and by setting out and championing best practice. There are all sorts of different options for de-risking demand-side flexibility. For example, you can have a price cap on a dynamic tariff. You can have upside-only offers like critical peak rebates for where you get money back for reducing during peak times. You can use data and digital technology to warn customers if they are using energy in a way that sets them up for a big bill that month, so they can have time to reduce their behavior before they get that bill. And suppliers as well, suppliers hedging, which is when suppliers, instead of waiting to the lowest price point to buy all of their generation, they make smaller trades across a longer window, which reduces the price generally. It increases the price a little bit generally, but reduces the risk of a huge bill shock over time, particularly important right now. And also just easy switching rights, so customers aren't locked in and they can go to a different type of tariff if they're not working for them. So all of these things help to address the risk perception of flexibility. And we also need to make sure that we are having inclusion by design. So we're not just designing products and services and then saying, oh, this don't work for low income or vulnerable customers or elderly customers. We need to actually use that innovation process to make sure that we are designing prototypes for different types of customers at the outset. So concluding thoughts, how do we unlock flexibility? We need to treat households like the vital household flexibility, like the vital energy infrastructure that it really is. The resources themselves might be decentralized, but that makes it more important that policy is joined up and coherent, not less. We need a policy toolkit for encouraging a critical mass of demand-side flexibility to drive down those costs and to make them more accessible to everyone without subsidies, just as we've done with wind and solar. But innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are real significant efficiency savings to be made, but that value is currently locked up in the system. So we need to find ways to align household incentives with system efficiencies. And clear market signals are really essential for this, so that we can set innovative suppliers and third parties up for success in the private sector. But we can't just price and pray. Customers need to be able to easily access affordable, flexible assets and attractive retail products. And that is how we can kickstart a positive feedback loop. Thank you very much. Just a shout out to my mother for painting me this picture, which she called the Joy Flex, so I thought I'd include it as well. Thank you.